Mike Costello, and I'm here with Dr. Iris Freelander. And today we're going to talk to you about the dynamic of consciousness. In metaphysical New Thought philosophy, we say so often on this program and in our teaching that we live in our minds and not in the world. And we certainly believe that. We believe in many ways that we live in the world in which we have our daily lives. But the fact is that you and I and all of us live in our minds. What goes on in the way that we think, the way that we think about circumstances and situations, determines the quality of our being. I guess we should begin by talking about what consciousness really is, Iris.
I suppose so. And consciousness, of course, is individual consciousness and mass consciousness. And then there's the collective consciousness. So it's more than just one aspect, isn't it?
It is. It's more dynamic than just our individual consciousness or awareness. I guess the beginning point is to talk about the fact that all of us have a level of consciousness, and that is awareness, or the dynamic of how our mind operates and what goes on through our thought processes. And so often we talk about the fact that consciousness and the dynamic of mind is not the same, or not necessarily connected to the brain. And we think so often that our thoughts are only our brains, but in fact our consciousness goes beyond the dynamic of the brain and what goes on in our head, so to speak.
Yes, and of course the psychologists have found, especially during the biofeedback work, that we have alpha, beta, delta, and theta. So we have those four states of consciousness coming from our own aspect of beinghood. And then we have the collective consciousness that Dr. Carl Jung defined. And then we have the mass consciousness, which is a conglomerate. So it's interesting, isn't it?
It is a tremendously interesting field. And I think in today's environment, we hear a lot of discussion, not only in psychological circles and sociological circles, but in religious and spiritual circles about consciousness and the value and importance of consciousness. In our faith tradition, of course, we believe in the dynamic of mind and the reality that God is and possesses divine mind, and the connection that each of us have with the divine mind or with the mind of God begins the process of how our thought processes are created. And of course, if we believe that we're spiritual beings in addition to being physical beings, then we know too that when the physical body passes away, that the consciousness or the awareness survives. And that dynamic is just fundamental to what we teach.
Yes, and it lives forever. It is eternal. And it's hard for some people to grasp that, but it makes death far more palatable, doesn't it? If we do believe in that way.
It is much more palatable. Now, mass consciousness and the collective consciousness have to do with the fact that as our minds operate, yours and mine and those who are watching and everyone on this planet, as our minds operate, those thoughts go out in the form of vibration, and they actually send out influences. And that's a new idea or concept for many people, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But we can know from our own aspect of being that when we're in meditation, we're in one state of being, and when we're in animated conversation, we're in another, and when we're in reverie, we're in another. So it should be easy for everyone to see that we don't just have one state of consciousness.
Right. One state or one level of consciousness.
Yes.
And of course, the most common thing that people think about is when they're conscious or unconscious.
Yes.
And when we think about somebody that's unconscious, we think about the person getting knocked out or being asleep or unaware. But in fact, as we go through our lives, our daily lives, our waking lives, we are often in states of semi-consciousness or unconsciousness. And so often in the church, we talk about the fact that most people are not conscious of the present moment, the fundamental the now experience that we talk about. And when we go through life and go through our experiences and spend our time thinking about things in the past or thinking about things that are coming in the future, we move out of the present state of our consciousness and we move into a semi-conscious or an unconscious state. And one of the examples we use so often is driving. Almost all of us drive unconsciously, and that's pretty frightening. But we get where we need to go. But when we're driving our car, we're going down the street that may or may not be familiar. We're watching the gauges, we're watching the speed, we're taking care of the operation of the automobile, and at the same time, we're actually thinking about what it is we did this morning or had for breakfast or what we have to do when we get to work. And so it is possible to move through life in a semi-conscious or unconscious state, which is something that we really need to be aware of. And we need to be aware of whether or not we spend most of our consciousness in the present, or whether we spend more time in the past or in the future in this semi-conscious or unconscious state. Because as we move out of our conscious state, we lose touch with where we are. We lose touch with the present moment. And because of that, we influence the consciousness around us. That's the collective consciousness.
Yes. Well, it's good to know that we can sharpen our consciousness and sharpen our minds. And as you said, the mind is not all of the consciousness, but it's we have a mental body, and the mind is of the mental body, but not nearly all of it. But we can consciously make it more acute, make our minds more viable, more active, or we can just be in a slough all the time.
Right. And we can make our consciousness, we can train our consciousness to operate in the present moment or in the now, to
Yes.
be more fully alert and aware. And then we bring in the spiritual dynamic that we teach so often, and that is the positive aspect of consciousness, or living in the mind, or living in our minds as opposed to living in the world, so that the circumstances and situations that present themselves to us, and we all have good times and bad times. We have joys and we have sadness. We have tremendous successes and we have defeats. We have depression and we have elation. We have all of these things, all of us. It doesn't matter who we are, what our background is, what our faith tradition, what our ethnic makeup. What doesn't have anything to do with the reality of that dynamic of our being. And so, as we are able to be aware of the fact that our minds are determining how we respond to the things that are happening, we can become creators with the divine and creators within our own consciousness of how it is we deal with the challenges and circumstances of life. And everything that we talk about on this program and everything we talk about in our outreach has to do with creating a confident living environment, or creating an environment in which we can live in a confident, self-sufficient, and empowered way. And we do that by employing some simple techniques, and among those are the techniques that we're talking about today, and being aware of our consciousness. And so as we train our consciousness to deal with circumstance and situation, then we're able to look at something that happens. Maybe someone is faced with a financial challenge, or maybe someone else is faced with a relationship challenge, or maybe someone else is faced with a health challenge, whatever challenge we are faced with in our lives. And we'll all be faced with many at different points in time. The way that we think about them determines the impact that they have upon us, and the way that we think about them determines how it is we move through that experience, and whether we get through it and grow through it, or whether we stay in it. And so often we stay in these negative experiences in our thought process, in our consciousness, and then we even retreat further in that we go into the past, or we look into the future, and we just stay in that fuddle, which is really a horrible place to be, but a place that many of us find ourselves over and over again.
Yes, but if we consciously do, as you just said, and realize that we are co-creators with Creator God, realize we do create our own environment, we create our own reality, we create everything around us, then we would be more thoughtful, wouldn't we? When we can remember that.
We would be more thoughtful about our thoughts.
Yes.
And so often we say words and thoughts have molding power, so let us careful be. Because our words and our thoughts, and of course our words come from our thoughts, proceed from thought. And so our thoughts are really determining the fiber of our being. And so often in spiritual circles, we're taught that we just kind of turn it over to God, and that it's going to get taken care of. And it doesn't take anything away from the reality and the presence and power of God to say that it isn't enough to turn it over to God. It's more appropriate to turn it over to ourselves together with God, and to condition our mind, our consciousness, and our thought process to be in alignment with the divine, and then we're guided and directed to do what we need to do to get ourselves through these experiences instead of just giving up.
And that's a very interesting concept to grasp, isn't it? But if we can grasp that and live by it, then we live far more fulfilling lives, and we're able to know that we are part of Creator God. We know that we are responsible in our own right, but that we do have the overshadowing of the infinite divine spirit. So it makes life far more exciting and interesting, and we're far less apt to be in sloughs of despondency and to go into the negative aspect, aren't we? If we can just keep that thought uppermost.
Absolutely. And it also makes us, or it calls us, it doesn't make us, but it calls us to be personally responsible.
Yes.
And I think that's a fundamental of spiritual faith. That is to be personally responsible for our own lives and for the way that we deal with the circumstances and situations of our lives. And that doesn't, again, take anything from God.
Yes.
God is there and eternal and never failing. But the fact is that so often we're able to use our spirituality or our religion as a basin in which to catch all of the problems of life, when in fact we need to take responsibility for them. And of course, we believe firmly that God put us here to get good at the process of living the life that we were created to live. And in doing that, we need to align our thought process with the dynamic of the process of thinking that God had and has, and then we're empowered to do the things that we need to do.
Yes, because we wouldn't need be here on earth if there wasn't a divine plan for us to mature, grow, expand, and use our own initiative, would there?
And we believe firmly that life is the school of the soul.
Yes.
And so all of life is here to teach us lessons. And it isn't about retribution, and it isn't about punishment, and it isn't even about cause and effect. It's about learning the lessons that we've come into this life to come to know.
And if we can remember that, then we can just drop the negative aspect of being. Isn't that true?
Very, very true. And so fundamental to our teaching is the positive aspect of life. And that is giving up the negatives and not allowing, that doesn't mean the negatives won't exist, but it does mean giving up the power that the negative influences over our life have to bring us down, if you will, and to defeat us. Instead, to choose to live a positive and an affirmative life. We'd like to pause at this point in the program and offer you the opportunity to receive some literature that will help you to understand more fully the ideas and concepts we're sharing with you.
We would like to give you the opportunity to explore and discover in your own home the new thought teachings that this program is sharing with you by sending you a free copy of one of these booklets. Simply address your request to Confident Living at P.O. Box 7726, Long Beach, California, 90807. Whatever your dream, whatever your vision, you can reach it through Confident Living.
Before the break, we were talking about the negative aspects and the positive aspects of consciousness. Probably we should have started with the positive and the negative instead of saying the negative and the positive.
Yeah.
But we do have a tendency in our consciousness, that is, we as people, as human beings, have a tendency to draw upon the negative, don't we, and to dwell upon it because we all get faced at different points in time with challenges.
Yes, and when we do, if we take time to align ourselves to Creator God, and we can align our consciousness consciously, then it makes all the difference in the world. And that's where meditation is so important, because aligning ourselves is the first step toward a positive meditation, isn't it?
It is. The aligning, or as we call it, centering
Yes.
ourselves, or the Eastern philosophy often says centering.
Yes.
And I think we in the West are just beginning to understand the centering presence. And we believe, of course, in New Thought philosophy that that centering presence and philosophy is fundamental to the teachings of Christ Jesus, that he taught his followers to center themselves in oneness with the Creator God. And it's a little departure from what many have learned in the traditional sense of understanding Western Christianity, in that God becomes, in this situation, a positive, affirmative source that never changes. You know, so often in the West we say
Yeah.
it's the will of God that this or that happen, when in fact the will of God never changes. The will of God is constant for us, and that's good and only good. What changes is our relationship and our understanding and our consciousness in terms of our relationship to the presence and the power of God. So anytime we change our way of thinking and align our consciousness with the dynamic of the mind of God, which is constant and constantly good, and not judging us and not making decisions for us, but opening us to the reality of where we should be, then we're able to center our consciousness and to operate and move through life in an empowered and in a strengthened way. And it's a different concept, and it's a new concept. And of course, one of the things we say so often is we're not talking about anyone changing their faith tradition, and we're certainly not criticizing anybody's religion. What we're saying is that this dynamic of metaphysical new thought faith can be applied to any religious background or any religious faith, and it has to do with our way of thinking and aligning our way of thinking with the mind and the thinking or the thought process of God, which is constant and good and only good. And we do that by centering. And so meditation, let's talk just for a minute about the importance of meditation. So often we in the West understand prayer, and we spend a lot of time praying. And we have done a number of programs on prayer and how we believe scientific or new thought prayer is different than the prayers of pleading that we're so accustomed to in tradition. But we do promote the concept of meditation, which is separate and different than prayer. And I think many in the traditional Christian traditions are beginning to understand and embrace the value of meditation, aren't they?
Yes, more and more people are meditating. Business people are meditating more in their offices or wherever, and they're extolling the value of meditation. And that's a wonderful thing that it's becoming more prevalent in the workplace, because it will make the workplace a more calm aspect of being, won't it?
Absolutely. And meditation doesn't even have to be religious.
Yes.
And certainly, I think religion is one of the things that builds more fences for us than anything else. And it doesn't even have to be overtly spiritual. And one of the great ways that you pointed out is the use of meditation in business, visualization, and the use of these techniques for the reduction of stress, for the opening of creativity, for the empowerment, and for the freeing of the mind, which many people have found to be extremely beneficial in their material lives, in the business world. But they're also spiritual principles and can be applied equally as well for the interior improvement of our being and the creation of a more positive consciousness.
Well, of course, too, prayer is talking to God and meditation is listening. And as we listen, we can gain any kind of information we want. We can ask any question in meditation and get an answer. And people do all the time. And it's so valuable that it's amazing that more and more people don't take advantage of it.
That's absolutely true. We often refer to God as infinite intelligence.
Yeah.
And the fact is that God has not only abundance, but infinite intelligence. And if in fact we are children of God, which we all are, there's no one who isn't, and no being on this planet that isn't a child of God and isn't loved equally as all others with God. And so we need to understand and realize that that ability is so accessible to us and so easily attained.
Yes, and when you said everyone is loved equally, that's so important for us to remember. And if we remember certain aspects of those truths, then we can be more relaxed in our own meditation, because we know that we're all equal on that basis. And we know that, so we just attune ourselves to God and feel the oneness with all of humanity, because there is that oneness, the connection, and that's the group, the mass consciousness, the global brain. We can call it what we like, but it's all the same thing. It's the global brain. And we see proof of that all the time, that there is such. When certain things happen in the world in one part of the country, they happen simultaneously in another part of the country. So we have that proof, don't we?
We do. And also a simple way of just validating that for people to understand is we all have had the feeling when we walk into a room or into a group of people of either feeling good or feeling bad,
Yes.
of either feeling welcomed or feeling a coldness. And the fact is that all of us are constantly sending out conscious thought. We're actually sending out vibrations in the form of consciousness. And that consciousness is going out from us and is felt by those around us, and we all feel it.
Yes.
And so when we get a number of people together and we direct the consciousness in a positive or affirmative way, then dynamic things happen. A great example is on the religious level or the spiritual level is any kind, it doesn't matter what the religious tradition is, a divine healing group, where you get thousands of people who are interested in spiritual healing, and the consciousness is directed on healing, on that dynamic, then things begin to manifest because the collective consciousness has brought thousands or hundreds of people into one room for that purpose. On a secular level, we can see it at a political convention where you bring thousands or hundreds of people into a room and they begin to build the same feeling or the commonality of their consciousness, which in that case is very positive. On the negative side, we see it happen with the negative consciousness that comes into a group of people who come together with one leader or more people, more than one person, who begins to build upon negative thoughts, project negative images, and speak negative words, and that then becomes collective. A great example of that is what we experienced in World War II with Adolf Hitler. These are simple dynamics, but they are infinitely impacting the universe, because when we begin to put 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 people together and create within them a conscious thought, and then each of them subscribe to it, they create a collective environment, and that, or a collective consciousness within the environment, and that collective consciousness has a life of its own, if you will, and that in turn creates the global consciousness. And there is a global consciousness which is created out of the minds of all of the multiple millions of people on this planet.
You know, it's frightening in a sense to know, but it's also exciting and encouraging to know that our thoughts create the tornadoes, the hurricanes, all those aspects of being. And if we all have peaceful thoughts, then we would no longer have the hurricanes, the tornadoes, and so forth.
In our lives and on the planet, although some of those things are good. And, you know, so often we see things that we believe are negative when in fact they may not be. And so we need to be cautious of not trying to control anything, but instead trying to create our individual consciousness in the awareness that it has a collective impact. And I think nowhere do we know that better, and we need to be sensitive to it than in the home. Whatever the home environment is for people, whether it's a traditional family or an alternative family or simply living with other people or with a small group or living alone, we create a consciousness within our living environment. And that consciousness is going to create the life that we live, and it's going to create things. And the things that it's going to create and the environment that it's going to create is going to be positive or it's going to be negative. And of course, what we profess is creating a positive consciousness that's aligned with the presence and the power of God in a non-judgmental, absolutely tolerant way. And in that way, we begin to build a consciousness that is aware, that is centered, and that is divine. And then great and good things begin to happen. And then the people around us are empowered as we are empowered, and that empowerment and that strength goes out. And it goes out into the consciousness of the group, it goes out into the consciousness of the world, it goes out into the consciousness of the globe.
I hope that our audience who's listening will take those words to heart and know that they are partly responsible for the global brain, for the world consciousness, the mass consciousness, and they're responsible for their own environment, they're responsible for their own thoughts, and we have that personal self-responsibility that if we adhere to that and follow through, then the world is a better place.
That's indeed true. And we need to understand that we are personally responsible on the material level and the spiritual level. God finished with us in Genesis. You know, God created all that is, created it good, and gave it to us. And anything negative that's happened in the intervening years is the responsibility of humankind. And the responsibility that God has is to create within us, and the gift that God has given us is to create within us the consciousness of love and acceptance and tolerance and all of the positive affirmations that we know are fundamental to every faith. And that's really tremendously important, so that we don't expect God to solve the problems. And by not expecting God to solve the problems, we're not detracting from that reality.
And accepting the fact that God gave mankind free will, gave us individually free will, and we are responsible for that free will and for whatever we create with it. God doesn't judge, we judge. God is love, and God is all good.
Absolutely. And only good is going to happen to us.
Yes.
And even though we're going to go through a lot of processes. In the last couple of minutes that we have, I guess what we could do is spend a couple of moments talking about how we can bring peace to our own consciousness. And I guess a beginning point is to be aware of how it is our minds operate. Are you, I mean, this is as we look at our individual lives and do a little self-examination, we need to ask, am I a person who sees life in a positive or affirmative way, or am I a person who sees life in a negative and pessimistic way? Do I see the environment around me as being supportive and loving and good to myself and others, or do I see it as being hostile and dangerous?
Mhm.
If we see ourselves as negative, then we need more negative than positive, then we need to examine our consciousness and the way
Yes.
that our mind operates. Then the second I think that I would invite people to do is to examine whether they spend more time in the present moment or whether they spend more time thinking about the past and how it used to be or how it was, or time spending some more time thinking about the future and the way it might be. And in religion, we get into a lot of that because that fine day in the by and by is something that's easy to buy into and wait until we die. Well, the fact is that we have things to do in these years while we're alive. And so it's very important that we do that. But that being in the present moment and giving up being in the past and being in the future all the time. So those two things I think are important. And there are others I'm sure that you can think of.
Well, a good important thing to remember is forgiveness is so very important in our lives. If we don't forgive the people around us, then we're selling ourselves short. We must do that.
We must be forgiving and we must forgive others and ourselves, because we have to be charitable to ourselves and to all the people around us. Dr. Freelander and I have been sharing with you concepts and ideas about confident living. And today we've been talking about consciousness. And we invite you to examine your consciousness, your way of thinking, realize and understand that you live in your mind and not the world. And if you change your way of thinking, you can change your life. We look forward to seeing you next time.
This program is a community outreach of Christ Church. Dr. Mike Costello speaks each Sunday morning at 11 a.m., and Dr. Iris Freelander speaks on Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. at the church. On Sunday evenings at 6 p.m., there is a meditation and healing service. Come and join us. You will be warmly welcomed.